FlaskCon. Welcome to my talk about customizing VS Code for Flask. I'm Pamela Fox. I am currently at Microsoft, which is the creator of VS Code. So disclosure, this is what I work on. I also work on other things at Microsoft like Python and on Azure and OpenAI and all that sort of stuff. Before Microsoft, I was teaching Python at UC Berkeley, also teaching Scheme and some other languages. I also created the computer programming courses for Khan Academy. That was in JavaScript, HTML, and SQL mostly. I worked at Coursera. I worked at Google. I worked on a chatbot called Wobot. So I've been in the industry for a while, and I've also been in academia and doing everything between. And all throughout, I have enjoyed using Python and Flask. So I am excited to be able to talk about how to try and get the most out of VS Code when you are developing Flask applications. All right, I am actually here with a colleague, Don Wages, who is going to be helping out with getting started with our Flask app in VS Code. So here we have our Flask app. This is a really straightforward app that's got pages and database and the sort of thing you're going to see in lots of apps. Okay, Don, so how do we get started with running our Python web app in VS Code?
Well, first you have to address your environment. So most of the time, traditionally, we're using a virtual environment. That's what I always use. So we'll do Python, Vim. If you want to do Command P to get to the command prompt, and then you'll do caret and then interpreter.
Select
And
interpreter.
interpreter, yeah, there you go, select interpreter. And then you also see that Python 311, that's the virtual environment interpreter that we've created. And so now that is selected. And if you look at the bottom right hand of your application, you can see it showing up there, and that kind of confirms it a bit too. And I see it also introduced a problem, which was an expected problem, which is great. If you see on at the top of your terminal, there is a warning sign by ZSH. That means that it just started something in the middle, and they want you to reload.
Okay.
Yeah, and then you create a new one.
So we've got a virtual environment now, and we've got the
Hmm.
interpreter selected down here.
Hmm.
So now we just need to follow the README instructions here to install all the packages. So I think I must have already do some installation. We'll see. Now we're installing the Flask app as an editable application so that we can refer to it by its application name. And it's bringing in a bunch of packages and Flask extensions and such. Okay, next step is the database. So actually I need to export my my database commands. So for my database configuration, Postgres port, mine is actually running on 5433 for whatever weird reason. And database is Postgres, and username is Postgres, and password is empty. This is obviously only for local. This is not my actual production database information because that would not be very secure.
And very, very scary. Yes.
Yeah. At random migrations, I think it's already been migrated, this one. And then I see the data. It says database seeded. Okay. And then we can try running the app using the Flask app run command, and we're doing it with reload and debug, and we're running it at port 8000. So now I can open it up and can see, here it is. When I am personally developing Flask web applications, I like to do all my work inside a dev container. A dev container is a containerized environment for VS Code. And the way that we can open this dev container is to go to the command palette and say rebuild and reopen in container. What you can see is that VS Code basically reloads, and what it's doing, it's actually building a Docker container behind the scenes that it's going to run that container. And so all of my environment will be in that container. It does take a bit of time the first time that you're building a container, but then going forward, if you haven't changed anything about the container configuration, it's quite fast to open because it just needs to run an existing Docker image. The dev container has now fully loaded, and I can close the terminal for everything that it did, or I could keep it open if I want to check it out. But let me explain how this dev container works. So we have .dev container folder with devcontainer.json inside it. This is the bare minimum that you need in order to have a dev container. And this devcontainer.json describes both the container environment as well as additional settings for whatever editor you're using. So here we're using VS Code. You could also use this in GitHub Codespaces, and there's beginning to be support for other editors as well. So here we can see that we've told it to use this Docker compose file to actually build the containerized environment. And we give it some information about what it's going to run inside that compose file as our main environment. So let's take a look at that Docker compose. So what you immediately see is that we do set up a Postgres database. I love this because I really don't like setting up local Postgres. I love to always run Postgres inside the container so that I can have a database that is scoped just for this app that I'm working on. And I find this is really, really convenient if you find yourself working on lots of different apps with databases, is to really scope that database to the container. So that's what I've done here. So we've got a Postgres image running on a DB service, and we've got a little health check here to check when it's ready. And then we've got the actual app itself. And this is, what will basically be running inside as our terminal. So this is based off a Docker file, and we're setting environment variables based off that Postgres image we just set up. And we're storing the Postgres data in a volume. So now we can take a look at the Docker file. It is bringing in Python 3.12, which is latest and greatest of Python stable. It is installing the Postgres client if you want to do PSQL. And then it is installing the requirements dev, so that we have everything that we need in order to run the app. Now, if we go back to devcontainer.json, we've got more going on here. So it's saying we can also use devcontainer.json not just to set up the actual Docker container, but also to set up things about our editor. So for VS Code, I say, these are the bare minimum extensions that I want. I can also bring in more extensions from my default profile, but these will always come with this container. I can set up the settings. So I say, where's the Python? Am I using Pytest? What files should it ignore? And then also setting up the rough editor for linting. So you're saying I'm going to use rough, I'm going to format on save, I'm even going to have it organize imports. So that way I get real-time linting feedback. I'm bringing in this AZD CLI that I use for deployment. That's a feature which kind of is like a way of bringing in an additional feature to your Docker container without having to write a bunch of Docker file code. And then finally the post create command. And this actually does a lot of work to install things so that I don't have to run all those commands. So you can see here, it's installing the Flask app as an editable application. It's running the migrations here, and it is seeding it. So that means by the time my container is fully set up, this has run. And that's actually the most recent thing that run. You can see that here where it says database seeded. So that means once the container is started up, I am ready to run this app. And that is how I like to work on applications, is just be ready to go and have everything set up and have it all taken care of by the dev container. So now we should be able to run the app and just have it work. And there we go. If you're interested in setting up a dev container for your Flask application, I have dev containers for pretty much all my projects these days. So you can see lots of Flask projects listed on my GitHub repo. We also have a bunch more listed on this repo here. So you can see Flask apps here. So we also have Flask apps that set up Mongo. So if you use Mongo, you can see how we would set that up in a dev container using a Mongo service instead of a Postgres service. Let's talk about debugging. It's great when your app works, but what about when it doesn't work? So let's say we're filling out this form, click save, and we see a SQL Alchemy error. Eek! All right, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna run in debug mode. So we'll close out this server here, and we're gonna set a breakpoint in the relevant function. So we'll set the breakpoint on the first line of the function, and then we're going over to the VS Code run and debug. There's this Python Flask option, and that is customized via this launch.json configuration here. So if we want to change anything about it, we'll change this launch.json. Let's try it out first and see if it's going to work. So we click play to start debugging, and we see that the server starts, and we open it up, and the server is running here. And now we're going to do the same thing that caused the error before. And this time it has come back into VS Code, so it actually switched windows for me. And you can see that it is at this line where we put the breakpoint. So you can see this little arrow around it, which means that's where it's, where it's currently paused. And we can see the call stack. We can see the locals, if there are any locals, not yet. We can see the globals, so the blueprint, the database, the models module, and the global request. And we could also put stuff in the watch. So we could put, name in the watch if we want to watch that variable once it is defined. So now, when we're here, we can see, okay, this line is saying request.form.get full name. Okay, so we can step over this line, and we can see that name is actually now equal to none. Let me make that bigger. So name is now none. And that implies that request.form.get couldn't find full name. So now what we might want to do is actually just look at request.form. So I'll just put that in the watch. And I can expand that and actually see the properties in it. So I can see that there's a name key and an email, cruise ID, and notes, but not a full name key. So this is a problem where I've named the key incorrectly, which is a pretty classic issue. And now we could go and we could actually see like, okay, well, email address, that's also, also wrong there. Cruise ID look good, notes looks good. So if we go through this time, we're still going to get the same error because it's still running on the old code. But what we can do is just continue, and we'll go back and see that error, and then we'll just go do it again. And say hi. And we go back into here. And when we see this time, we see that name gets set to Pamela. So that's pretty promising. Now we can make the DB info request. And we could take a look and see what DB info request looks like. So I can just look at the locals. Okay, so in locals, we have the name. We've got DB info request. It's got a cruise ID, an email, a name, notes. That's looking really good. And then we add it, we commit it, we make our message, and we can check the message looks good. Thank you, Pamela. And return. And we can just press play at this point, go back to the browser, and we see that it did work. So I really encourage you to use the debugger when you're in VS Code, because it is so nice to be able to step through things and, watch whatever you want to watch, look at the locals, look at the globals, look at the call stack. It's very, very helpful, and there's a lot you can configure about the debugger. Let's look more closely at this configuration. So this is the Python Flask one that we launched, and you can see it's a type Python with module Flask. So that's basically like Python-m Flask. Then we set some environment variables. So we're using the Flask app environment variable to point at our Flask application. And then we're setting Flask debug to 1. And this is really interesting because we do want Flask to be in debug mode, because if it's not in debug mode, then it's actually going to serve 500 pages instead of actually causing the error to happen. And you can see in the Flask documentation, they actually talk specifically about how to work with external debuggers, and they do recommend running in debug mode, but then with no debugger. So you can see here that when we pass in the args, we're telling it to run without the debugger while still being in debug mode. So it's a kind of a subtle point. Make sure that you've got your configuration correct with those two. We give it a port to run on, and we tell it to be in reload mode. And then we've got these arguments here. So Jinja true means that we should be able to actually debug inside Flask templates, Jinja templates, which are really cool. And then just my code is a Boolean that tells the debugger whether you want to step into code that is not in, your workspace, right? Do you want to step into third-party packages, right? So if there's, if you're telling it to step into, is it going to actually step into a Flask function or a Flask class? So I've actually set to false because I often do want to step into frameworks, and that's how we fix framework bugs. But a lot of times you might want to set it to true, just so it's easier to step in and out when you're going through debugger. So there you go. VS Code does come with a default Flask configuration, but you may want to customize it, and hopefully this gives you an idea of how you might want to customize it. Now let's talk about testing, because a great way to make sure that you don't have bugs is to write a lot of tests and to write very thorough tests. So in this repository, we have a few varieties of tests, all using the Pytest framework. So we can see we've got local tests, and these are the ones we're going to be working with here. And we've got these tests here. These are kind of your classic Flask application tests. So they are using the Flask test client. That's a client that is offered by the Flask library itself. And we set that up as a fixture here, and then we send GET or POST requests to that throughout these tests. But we did have to set up this initial app fixture, and there's a fair amount of effort that goes into that. So we can take a look at comptest.py. This app with DB fixture is the one that actually yields a Flask application, and it actually does a lot of work in terms of the database setup. So we create the application using our app factory function, and we pass in some config override in case someone wants to specify like a test database URL, and we specify that we're in testing mode in case that affects anything. Then we set up the database. So we create all, so that's going to create all the tables in the test database. We also seed it with our test data here. And then we also just prep this engine cleanup list, which tells us what connections we're going to need to clean up after the tests are done. Then we can yield the app. So when you write a Pytest fixture like this and you have a yield, that means that's what is actually going to be given to the tests. And then everything after the yield is like a teardown. It's the kind of cleanup code. It's what gets executed when the tests are done using this, this object here. And we are using a session mode for this fixture. So that means this fixture is going to be made once, and then once the tests are done, it will, run this code just once, actually, once per session. Looking back at the tests, we can see that, first we create this client fixture that creates a test client based off that app with DB fixture. And then we use client throughout all these tests here. Let's try running these tests just using python-m pytest and then source tests local test pages.py. And we see that 6 passed, but 1 failed. There are also a bunch of deprecation warnings we should look at. So now I actually want to show the VS Code testing tab to show how we could, do the same thing using the testing tab, since this talk is all about VS Code. So this is the testing tab. It tries to discover all the tests in your workspace using the standard test discovery mechanisms for Python tests. And you can see any tests that we've run in the past. So I'm going to go ahead and run these tests just by pressing play on the whole file. And we can see that one did fail, and it actually annotates the file with the failure, which is really nice because we can just see it in line. And what it says is that it's working outside of application context. This typically means you attempted to use functionality that needed the current application. To solve this, set up an application context with app.app context. This is a really common error to run into when you are writing tests. Typically, you don't run into it as much inside the app because you're usually in an app context. So what we're going to do is we can see at the traceback that it happened when we called dbSession.query on line 71. So let's go down here and make an app context using that app with DB, because that is an application object. And so we're going to say, okay, do all of this with that app context. And hopefully that'll make it happy. So now we can just rerun just this one test. That's something that's also really cool about the testing tab. And it passed this time. So that fix did work. So you can take advantage of this testing tab if you like having, this way of running tests, or you can run them in the terminal, whichever one works for you. But I do want to show up another feature of the testing tab, which is being able to debug your tests. So we're combining, the debugger mode that we saw before with actually running the test. And this is really powerful if you've got some weird tests behaving strangely. Yeah, you could put a bunch of print statements in there and then capture those print statements and all that stuff. But wouldn't it be cool if you could actually use a debugger? So let's say that I actually had, a bug in this code. Let's go ahead and introduce a bug into the code. So let's say I had this as, URL. And now I go ahead and run this test. And I get a bug. And it says, key error, bad request key error. I didn't understand. Okay. So I can see that, there was a problem on this line. And at this point, if I wanted to, I could actually go into debug mode. So what I'm going to do is set a breakpoint before the line, and then click on this debug test option. That actually opens up the debugger, and we can see our locals, so app with DB, client, response. We can see response.headers, and we can expand that and see what's in that header. So we see there's a header that has content type, content length, and location. We don't see a URL. We could also try saying here response.headers URL and seeing that does result in just a straight up error. So that's the error that we saw. So we replicated that. So we say okay, well, what if I did response.headers location? Would that work? And we can see that does look like what we want it to be. And we can even try other things, like what if we did lowercase location? Does that work? And it actually does. So that's really interesting. So this is obviously a special sort of object that behaves a little bit differently than like a standard dictionary. So we're going to say response.headers location, and then we can stop debug mode, go back to our testing tab, and then run the test again, and this time it passes. So this is another thing for you to take advantage of, is the fact that you can run tests in debug mode. This will use the default configuration for running tests in debug mode, but if you want, you can actually override that default configuration so that you can specify any sort of settings. So if we look at my launch.json, I do actually have a second configuration that is used by the debugger, and you can see it's used by the debugger because it says purpose debug text. And then the big thing that I customized here was this Pytest add ops no cov. So that is telling it not to run Pytest coverage, because Pytest coverage and the debugger, they actually use the same instrumentation approach when you're running tests. And so you shouldn't actually be running both of them at the same time. So if you are running to debug, You shouldn't be trying to get your coverage because they're both trying to, hold on to the code, inspect the code using the same mechanism. So you should either be debugging or running cov, but not both at the same time. And so that's what I'm customizing here. So take advantage of being able to customize that debug configuration if you need it. And if you do run into any issues, let the Python Viz Code team know. Let's talk about typing support. So these days in modern Python, you can add type annotations to variables, parameters, and return values so you can see what sort of type it's supposed to be. And these are optional and they're not actually enforced at runtime at all, but they can be very, very helpful when you're actually developing because you can get feedback from type checking tools and from extensions to let you know if you're using something correctly. And fortunately, most Python packages these days do support type hints, and that includes Flask and many Flask extensions. I want to make sure you know how to take advantage of type hints in VS Code for your Flask apps. First step is to make sure your Python interpreter is selected correctly. Okay, so we can go down here and click on the little Python version here, and we can click on it and we can see where it's coming from. And in this case, it's coming from the Python 3.12 in this deb container. If you're using a virtual env, make sure that this is pointing at the Python in your virtual env because it needs to be whatever interpreter is associated with the packages that you're using so that VS Code knows where to look up the packages and look up the types. The next step is to make sure you've got the Python extension for VS Code. This is the one that is actually made by Microsoft. And this gives you lots of support for working in the Python language. So you're going to want it for lots of reasons. So it's going to give you IntelliSense, linting, debugging, refactoring, variable export, lots of things, probably lots of things I have never used myself too. So make sure you've got that installed. And that should be enough to get you type hints. So let's go and try it out. So if we go down here, this page here that's trying to get destination detail, so let's say we didn't have that line of code yet. So I just know that, okay, I want a destination and I want to get it from the database. So this DB variable, this actually comes from the Flask SQL Alchemy extension. It's a very popular extension and I'm actually one of the maintainers for it now. And it also supports type hints and we've actually been trying to improve them lately. So it's gotten better in the last year. When we do db dot, we see what pops up are all the options of what we could actually call on db. And here we see a first or 404. That's for a select statement. And then we also have get or 404. It's like SQL alchemy.get, but aborts with a 404 not found. So that's perfect for when we're trying to get a single entity from the database. And we're trying to get it by ID. So you can see this takes an entity and then it takes a primary key to query. So we need to give it the model class and then the primary key. So we'll say getter 404 and then pass in the model class and then pass in the primary key, which comes from the parameter here. And then that the linter thinks it's good. And then we can also, we can keep mousing over these things and seeing what they are and seeing what the types are. And we can add more types. And you can see here, it now actually knows that this destination is a destination object. And that's very cool because then it would mean if we didn't want to pull something out of it, we say print destination dot, we can actually see the properties from that destination object. So this is working really nicely here. And then we can go ahead and pass the destination into render template along with everything else. We've got type hints for Flask things like render template. You can see them here when we mouse over, but also many Flask extensions have type hints. And if you're working with a Flask extension that doesn't have a type hint yet, maybe that's something you can contribute or file an issue about. It's a great way of getting started in a particular package. That's my experience. What would be a cool extension we could use now?
Well, because we have Postgres, we just got that installed. Let's do SQL Tools and SQL Tools Postgres cockroach DB extension.
All right. So SQL tools. Okay. So I
Mhm.
do have this one installed because I really like
Perfect.
it too. And then I also have the Postgres driver installed. So we're good there.
Awesome. And we
So
seeded the
then,
database. Would you like to click around? Click around? Awesome.
yes, let's try it out. Here it is. So we click add new connection, Postgres, and then I need to
Mhm.
add all my super secret info again. Postgres, empty password. All right. Save connection. Connect now. Cool.
I love this one. You taught me about this one on our live stream about a year ago. This is great.
It's really fun. So we can see the tables, make sure that the seeding all worked correctly. And we can even run SQL queries on it, but most of the time I'm just kind of clicking around and making sure things look good. But we're using Liveshare, which is this cool extension where you can do real-time developing. So if you are collaborating on a Flask application with someone else, you could use Liveshare. And let's try it out. So here I've got, pages.py open, Liveshare. So there's Don. You gonna document my code? So
Great app.
cool. And yeah, so it's shared server. So does that mean you can even see the Flask app running?
Yep. And it went
That's
up,
really
it opened on my local host.
all right, sweet. If Python developers want to find out more about VS Code, where should they go?
Well, we have release notes every month. So check out the Python dev blog. We're also doing release videos, so keep track of VS Code YouTube, and you can search on that YouTube channel. Oh, my dog came to say hi. There he goes. You can check out on the VS Code YouTube channel and type Python, and we'll have more and more videos coming out like that as well. Um, Also, go to the command palette. You have all of or most of the answers at your fingertips. So using Command P and then searching the command palette, most of the new features really just show up there. So you can just keep checking in periodically. There's monthly releases. And if you are on Insiders, you can get the latest and greatest, the bleeding edge, and then you can report issues and make us fix them.
All right, so that was it. Those are all the tips we wanted to share today about customizing VS Code for Flask. If you do ever run into issues, I run into them all the time. All software has bugs. Please do file them in the appropriate issue tracker. Here's a blog post I wrote that has links to lots of the issue trackers. Just put it somewhere and people will redirect you if it's in the wrong place. We need to keep getting feedback in order to make this experience better for people. So yeah, bang on it. Let us know what's working, what's not working, and also share your tips. I learn stuff about VS Code every day from my colleagues and just from developers on the interwebs. So I'd love to learn more about how to optimize Flask in VS Code. See you soon.